option. Use the stereo link if you have something like a stereo keyboard where you want the left and right sides to match and the faders to work together. With those housekeeping things out of the way, we now need to address the input gain. Signal flow and gain structure are two very important concepts in mixing. Fortunately, it's easy to consistently set gain by using our input meters that every channel has. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there. The meters are scaled digitally. 0 dBFS is the top of the meter. Therefore, unlike an analog scale where we would set our gain to 0 dB on that meter, with several dB above 0 before reaching clip, on here, if we set our gains to reach 0 dBFS, we have no headroom left. There's nothing above 0. Set the gain control so that your input meter averages around minus 18 dBFS. It can and should peak higher, but should average about minus 18 dBFS. When it comes to setting the gain structure using the Mixing Station app, we have to figure out the scale of the meter. Since it's beside the fader, do we assume those fader numbers have relevance? I did a test. I fed a 1 kHz tone into the console, and I set the input to read at just under minus 15 dBFS on the Essai Edit channel meter. You can see that translates to the first yellow light on the Mixing Station's app channel meter, regardless of the fader scale. I also confirmed the clip light will light at essentially the same time as when the input level reaches 0 dBFS on the Essai Edit meters. What this all means in layman's terms, to set your input gain on the Mixing Station app, you need to bring the signal up into the first yellow light or so on the meter for average levels, while allowing it to peak above that. Also, remember that since the gain control is the first control in the signal flow chain, you should always set it as your first step and strive to get it right so that you don't have to touch it again during the show. You also need to remember, since it is the first thing in the signal flow chain, if you change it later, it will change levels everywhere in the channel strip that follows that gain control. That means your house mix, the monitors, and stream mix will all change on that channel if you change your gain control after the show has started. Change it only when you absolutely have to, and don't continuously tweak on it during the show. On Essai Edit, if we go to the Input tab, these same settings are here. You can also see an Insert option here. It's fine as it is now by default, and it's also redundant on this screen, so we can address this later. Next, let's look at EQ. We have our low cut, also known as a high pass filter, and we can enable and set that here. While the high pass filter can be used for sound shaping, it's typically used to remove low end content from below whatever your source is capable of producing. For example, a bass guitar can reach down to 40 Hz on the low E string, so setting the low cut at 40 Hz would be a good starting point. A snare drum might have very little energy below 100 Hz, so it could be set there. A standard pop vocal could maybe be 100 Hz and probably even higher. Let's move on to our EQ bands. Always remember to make sure your EQ is enabled before making changes. You can also use the Enable/Disable button to compare your EQ'd signal against the un-EQ'd signal. That way you can make sure your EQ work is actually improving things. Many times, as with lots of things in mixing, less can be more. The frequency setting here is obvious, from low to high, bass to treble. You have a choice of PEQ, which is standard parametric EQ, VEQ, which is vintage EQ, which is just a different flavor of parametric, low and high cut options, and we have low and high shelving EQ options. Let's look at those first. The shelving EQ here will allow us to set a knee frequency, and a low shelf will allow us to raise or lower everything equally below that frequency. A high shelf will do just the opposite for the high side, allowing us to raise or lower everything equally above that knee frequency on the high side. Most consoles with fixed bass and treble controls are low and high shelf, normal setting we would want. If we click over to the main tab, we can see our pan control, which is pretty obvious. Slide it to the left or right to pan the signal to the left or right.
To the left. Panning to the right.
You can also see the main stereo left-right button. If this button is deselected and grayed out, then your signal won't be sent to the mains. You might want to do this if your band is playing to a click track, and of course you don't want that click track channel in the house sound, but do want it in your monitors. You would also want to deselect this if you're using this channel in a subgroup. The subgroup and DCA video talks about this more in depth, and I will definitely drop a link for that as well. And speaking of DCAs, we see our DCA options here. DCAs are another way to group channels to control the level of a group of channels with one fader. You can assign a channel to a DCA by selecting the DCA that you want to use here. There is also the auto mix setting here. Auto mixing is for conference type mixing. It is not for band mixing, so it's not going to put us out of business. And it's not really mixing per se. You still have to set up your channels just like we've been discussing in this video. Auto mix will help to track unused open mics and raise and lower volume as more or less mics are used on the conference panel. There's essentially two auto mix groups available, an X group and a Y group. Unless you have two specific groups of mics in use, you'll likely just need to use one group for a typical conference or panel discussion. Let's go on to the comp screen. The XR